I have a friend who jokes that everyone in the world should be allowed to vote in American elections because American elections matter for everyone in the world. But in the United States, foreign policy is almost totally irrelevant, which means that if you read Russian newspapers or even Ukrainian newspapers about the American elections, you can get a very misleading picture. The American elections are chiefly about character and trust. To some extent, they're about issues like ethnic and racial and gender identity. To a very small extent, they're about policy, but foreign policy comes into it only a little bit at the margin. And the only reason it comes in is that it comes knocking on the door. If it weren't for the fact that Russia is so interested in being a part of the US elections, Russia wouldn't be present at all either. As things stand, the only major issue in foreign policy which appears is the question of how to treat Russia. But that has to do with Russian foreign policy. It doesn't really have to do with the interests of the American people. Americans are not really thinking about foreign policy right now. Very few of the elites of the Republican Party actually support the Republican candidate for president. So that's unusual. We may be seeing the beginning of the end of the two-party system. A second thing which is unusual about this election is the strength of the cultural politics. The fact that the last president was an African American and the next president is very likely to be a woman is something which many Americans, not most, but many Americans find difficult to take. And so for people who have those kinds of racial or gender prejudices, this election is really about identity in a very, very basic way. And Donald Trump plays to that very aggressively. We have never had a public figure, much less a candidate for president, who has so aggressively, at least in recent times, so aggressively played on both racial and gender politics. And the third thing which is new and interesting, but which is not particular to America, it's common across the West, from us through Europe, through Ukraine to Russia, is factuality and non-factuality. So, I mean, rather than right and left, I think that the main distinction between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump is that Hillary Clinton basically resides in a boring world where facts are facts and truth are truth. And Donald Trump, a bit more like, let's say, a Russian politician, resides in a world where information is irrelevant and all that matters is posture and spectacle and striking a pose. That's always true to some extent in politics, but we've never had it in the United States to this extent. If you think of Ukraine, I would say that identity politics of the sort of, having to do with language or having to do with culture are less and less important in Ukraine. They're also less and less important in the United States. And 4 years from now, 8 years from now, I think these issues of gender and these issues of race are going to more or less have disappeared, just like issues of sexual orientation have more or less disappeared from politics. So I think this is historical in that this is you can see in Donald Trump the last attempt to use questions of identity as questions of politics. Now, if Trump wins, these will be historical elections in a different way, because if Trump wins, we will then see, I'm not sure exactly what, but we will see dramatic consequences, not just in policy terms, but I think the United States will likely cease to be and to seem to be a state which respects the rule of law. So if Trump actually wins, then these will be historic elections in a very different way. Almost no one is expecting that at this point, but it's still possible. This sort of historical populism where the Russian leadership talks about a Russian past which has no connection to reality at all, and is sort of pure poetry, or where people who are in favor of Brexit talk about an English past, which also doesn't really exist. England doesn't really have a past. Britain has a past. The British Empire has a past. But to look for an English past, you have to go back 1,000 years. Or French populists, Le Front National, imagining that the interwar French state was something good and desirable, when in fact it was in most ways a disaster, at least compared to France of today. We have that too. Donald Trump's main slogan is "Make America Great Again." But no one really has any idea what that again was. And in many respects, the United States of 2016 is a better country than pretty much any other version of the United States. Now, all of that said, it leads to a different issue, which is probably more important. One of the reasons why nostalgia matters, which doesn't have to do with identity, is economics. One way that the United States is becoming a worse country from the perspective of many of its citizens is in terms of inequality. And so many of the Trump supporters, they look at their children and they say, my children will never do as well as I did. And they're right? So they're looking at an objective phenomenon, which is the difficulty of moving upward in society. Again, something which Ukrainians know all about. They're looking at that and they're drawing cultural conclusions, which I think are the wrong conclusions. They're saying, okay, this is because the world is against us, or the women are against us, or the minorities are against us, or whatever. But there's a real problem. The problem of inequality is a real one. And as the United States becomes a society with greater and greater wealth inequality, candidates like Trump, populists who can say, like, I know about the world because I have lots of money, that kind of populism will probably have a future. Yeah, no, something really interesting and in some ways terrifying has happened in the last 4 or 5 years, and that is that in many ways the history has tilted. Where for a time it was true that countries in Eastern Europe were trying to become more like countries in Western Europe, or trying to become more like countries in the West, and succeeding in doing so in various ways. I think that period is now over. And what we're seeing instead is that history is now tilting a different direction, and many things which happened first in Russia or happened first in Ukraine then happen later in the United States, right? So I find it very interesting that the people who A, understood Trump, and B, said he was a real danger in the United States were very often people whose main job was to write about Russia or to write about Ukraine. It was very often people who were mainly looking at Russia or Ukraine or Eastern Europe who recognized this type of politics and said, no, this is real and this is dangerous. Most Americans didn't recognize it and also thought this can never really happen here, whereas of course it has happened here. So, my own perspective is that our problems overlap with Russian problems, overlap with Ukrainian problems, and sometimes one can learn from Russians and Ukrainians to figure out what's going to come next. It's very telling, for example, that the key document in this whole election, one of the documents that got Trump's main advisor fired, was something which was found by Serhiy Leshchenko, right? This is no coincidence. There are these meaningful connections between the way politics are done here and the way politics are done in Kiev and in Moscow.
Deporting undocumented workers. Well, he's used undocumented workers. He's made his product.
The main way that the Trump candidacy is like a Russian political campaign is this total indifference to the facts of the matter, like complete indifference to statistics, to experts, just to whatever might actually really be happening in the world, and a total reliance on gestures, spectacles, cliches, insults, references to violence, and references to sex.